All right, we're going over section 2 notes here. We're talking about the New England colonies today. In section 1, we mentioned that there were two main reasons for the English settlers to come to the Americas, either economic opportunities or for religious freedom. The Jamestown colony was started for economic opportunities. Here in section 2, with the New England colonies, a lot of these colonies will be started because of religious persecution, people looking for religious freedoms in some of the different parts of the Northeast, and we'll talk about that. But the 4 England colonies that we'll go over: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. And then we'll talk about the New England colonies. The next section will be the Middle colonies, and we'll talk about the Southern colonies. And you'll have to know all of these for your tests. What you need to know the different regions and what states were a part of, or what colonies were a part of those different regions. Okay, so the 4 of New England were New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and so make sure that you are familiar with that. So if you remember, we talked about the Reformation, and in 1534, the English broke away from the Catholic Church under Henry VIII. Well, yes, they broke away from Rome, but he made no changes to the church. They still followed Roman Catholic traditions and sacraments and different things. They basically were doing everything that they've been doing. They're just saying they've broken away from the Roman Catholic Church. It wasn't until it was King Edward VI, I believe, that what we know is the English Reformation started to happen, and these changes started to be made. And the Anglican Church is established there in England. Several of these people in England started to dissent from the Anglican Church, and that just means that they disagreed with Anglican beliefs. They disagreed with Anglican practices, things that were going on. We're going to see 2 groups emerge from these disagreements. First, you had the Puritans, okay? And we're going to talk about both of these groups coming to the Americas here in just a minute. But the Puritans were a group that wanted to reform the Anglican Church. Okay? They didn't agree with some of the practices, so they wanted to make changes. And I guess get back to the style of worship that they were used to. They didn't agree with everything, but they're not going to leave. They want to change it or to reform it. Okay. Then you had what was called the Separatists. These people wanted to leave the church altogether. They wanted to set up their own churches. They disagreed with all Anglican beliefs and practices, and so they just wanted to get away and to establish their new churches. Both of these groups are going to be persecuted in England. And because of that, they will flee to originally they'll flee to other parts of Europe, like the Netherlands and different places. And then they will eventually come to America and set up their settlements in what we know as the New England colonies. Okay. So the first colony that we'll talk about Massachusetts. Okay, there's actually 2 different groups that will come to Massachusetts. The second group is basically going to be responsible for establishing a permanent settlement and making Massachusetts the colony that it becomes. Okay, but we'll talk about the group before that because it's the one that we all know and have learned about for years since we've been in school. We've heard about this group of people. Okay. So a group of separatists who are being persecuted in England in 1620 are going to flee, and they're going to travel to North America. They actually receive a charter from the Virginia Company, just like the colony of Jamestown received that charter. So the Virginia Company gives the separatists this charter. Okay, yes, you can go set up your colony, your settlement. Any profit that you eventually make, we'll get some of that. So that was the original plan, was to send these separatists to Virginia, where Jamestown was as well. these individuals are known as pilgrims. Okay, and I know you talked about pilgrims before. There have been millions of pilgrims throughout history. A pilgrim is just someone who is moving or fleeing for religious reasons. So anybody that leaves one country to go to another because they're being persecuted because of their beliefs is considered a pilgrim. Okay, we know the pilgrim. We call them pilgrims. We know the pilgrims as when we think about Thanksgiving and all that. But there have been, like I said, millions of pilgrims throughout history when it comes to religious freedoms. And that's what I just said. They've been given this land grant by the Virginia Company. Okay. So on the journey, the navigator aboard their ship, the Mayflower, was pretty incompetent. He didn't really know what he was doing. They will end up 500 miles north of where they're supposed to be. They're supposed to land in Virginia. They will eventually land in what we know now as Cape Cod in Massachusetts. They'll start their settlement there. We know that as the colony of Plymouth. They'll be led by William Bradford in the beginning. Okay. Eventually, the governor of the colony will be a man by the name of John Carver. There's around 100 people that will travel over on the Mayflower. One of those, I think there's 41 men that came over on the Mayflower. One of those 41 men is I got to remember this, great grandfather. One of my ancestors. I believe it's 8 greats. I could be wrong on that, but I have an aunt that has traced our history back hundreds of years and realized that a man by the name of John Howland, who was an indentured servant and was a servant of the future governor, John Carver, he came over on the Mayflower. Funny story about that. In one of the storms, one of the masts broke or the sails had been damaged or something. And in this storm, he's actually blown off the ship. Well, because the ship had been damaged, there was a rope hanging in the water. He was able to grab hold of that rope, and they pulled him back up. Had he not grabbed the rope, I don't know that they would have turned around and gone back to get him. But he did. He was able to get back on the ship and became a member of that settlement, of that colony. So before they get off the ship, they're gonna sign what we know as the Mayflower Compact. They knew that when they got there, they had to have some sort of government. So they come up with these laws and these rules for their colony, and all the men will then sign that Mayflower Compact before they disembark onto shore. Well, the Mayflower Compact is going to become the first self-government plan in the colonies. Okay, and we talked about the House of Burgesses in Jamestown being one of the first legislatures that was elected. Well, this Mayflower Compact is the first self-government plan in what we will eventually know as the 13 colonies. The first winter, well, they're actually going to arrive in winter. They'll arrive in November. So from November through about February, it is one of the harshest winters on record in that area for that time period. Over half of the people that made it to Massachusetts will die that winter. So when spring hits, it's gone from 100 people to less than 50 because of starvation and freezing to death. I talked in the last section. They didn't have houses when they got here. They had to attempt to build these houses, build shelters, and somehow survive the elements that they were living in. Okay, that spring, they're going to be befriended by a couple of Native Americans named Squanto and Samoset. They're going to help them. They're going to teach them how to hunt different animals. They're going to teach them how to plant crops. And the Pilgrims were not used to planting these crops in this sandy soil. Well, these two individuals will help them and show them how they can plant crops in the sandy soil so that they will actually grow and produce a harvest. And so they'll learn these things. That fall, They'll have grown in abundance of crops. They will now know how to hunt. They're going to have a big, massive feast to celebrate them actually surviving and making it. And so in the fall of 1621, they'll have this feast. They'll invite their Native American friends and have this massive feast together. And we know that as the Feast of Thanksgiving. And that's where we get our idea of Thanksgiving today. Probably a little bit different than what you're used to in Thanksgiving. Probably didn't have ham and turkey and dressing, and it was more vegetables, fruits. There may have been turkey. There's probably some wild turkey that they killed. Deer, fish. Probably not some of the things that we eat today at Thanksgiving, but they did have this feast and were able to celebrate and give thanks for their survival. And the next group in Massachusetts was called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they're going to travel over about 10 years later. It's really in 1629 that they'll head over to North America. They're going to be led by a man named John Winthrop, and it's going to be this group that will actually have this permanent settlement and grow Massachusetts into a large colony that will eventually become the state. Okay, here, let me go back to that. They're going to travel and they're going to settle this colony that will eventually be known as Boston, which is today the capital of the state of Massachusetts. John Winthrop's going to bring around 900 people in this settlement here. This is going to be a group of Puritans who, again, are being persecuted. So they'll travel over for religious freedoms. They'll get here. They'll establish their settlement. Like I said, they will be very successful. Okay, in the next basically 10 years, there's going to be over 15,000 Puritans that will journey to Massachusetts for religious freedom. Okay, this is known as the Great Migration. So from 1630 to about 1640, we see the numbers in Massachusetts just skyrocket, and that's known as the Great Migration. Now, what's funny about this colony is that, yes, they're being persecuted, and so they'll travel over here for religious freedoms, but when they get here, they are very intolerant of other people's forms of worship. So if you came over and you decided that you wanted to worship a little bit different or had some different beliefs, you were shunned and basically kicked out of the colony. So they're being persecuted. However, they're not very tolerant of other forms of religion as well once they get over here. So it's kind of ironic how it happened. Eventually, adult male church members are allowed to vote. So as long as you were a man, probably over the age of around 21, and you were a member of the church, you could vote. Eventually, they will expand that to owning land will be a requirement. So adult male land-owning men that were part of the church were the voters in this colony. Indentured servants, slaves, things like that, they were obviously not allowed to vote in elections. Okay. All right, next we'll talk about Connecticut. Okay, so we've established Massachusetts. Now we'll talk about Connecticut. There was a minister in Massachusetts named Thomas Hooker, and he doesn't agree with how Winthrop is running the colony. He doesn't agree with some of his beliefs, especially when it came to church, some of his ideas. And so he basically kind of speaks his mind and is going to be kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Okay, so he's going to end up leaving with his congregation and starting in a new settlement. One of the things he didn't agree with is that adult male church members were the only ones that could vote. He believed that all men should be allowed to vote. Again, sorry, ladies, you won't get that opportunity for another 300 years, or 200 something years. But Hooker believed, all men, whether they own property, whether they're a member of the church, it didn't matter. They should be allowed to vote in any kind of election because they were a part of that colony. They were a part of that settlement. They should have a voice in the government. So he's going to take his congregation in 1636. He's going to move to the Connecticut River Valley. And eventually he will found the settlement of Hartford. Well, if you know anything about your geography, states and capitals, Hartford is the capital of Connecticut today. And that's going to be founded by Thomas Hooker and his congregation. In 1639, they will officially adopt their plan of government called the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This is going to be the first written constitution in what we know as America. Obviously, today, every state has their own state constitution. We have the national constitution. Okay, this will be the first written down constitution in America, the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. Again, put a little star next to that. Make sure you know that for your test. Next, we got Rhode Island. Okay, this is going to be founded by Roger Williams in 1636. He basically establishes Rhode Island as a safe place for dissenters or people who are disagreeing with the Puritans or the church. Anyone in Rhode Island was allowed to worship freely in this colony. Didn't matter what you believed. If you wanted to, however you wanted to worship, you were allowed to worship and have your religious freedoms in Rhode Island. And then last of the four is New Hampshire. Okay, 1638, John Wheelwright. And again, people who are disagreeing with the church, he's going to lead a group of dissenters, and they will start the town of Exeter in present-day New Hampshire. He'll establish this town, but it's not going to be until 1679 that New Hampshire actually becomes an independent colony. So it's going to be about 40 years before New Hampshire is an actual colony, but they will be one of the original 13 colonies once it's all said and done here in New Hampshire. Last thing we're going to mention here, we're going to talk about King Philip's War. King Philip was a Native American chief whose name was Metacomet. The colonists knew him as King Philip. His actual name was Metacomet. Okay, and there's going to be some disagreements and some problems, which is going to lead to this King Philip's War. As more and more people started to show up in New England, more settlers began to move and spread across New England. Well, we know that Native Americans were already there. A lot of these settlers are moving on to Native American lands without permission. They're forcing Native Americans off of their lands. Okay, they're not making these contracts with Native Americans to peacefully and with permission move on to the lands to start their settlements. Again, this is going to lead to war. King Philip, also known as Metacomet, was a Wampanoag leader, and he's going to basically declare war on the New England colonies in 1675, trying to get these settlers pushed off his lands and take his lands back. This war is going to last around 14 months. Eventually, the settlers will defeat Metacomet and his warriors, and will continue to spread out across Native American lands. And this is going to be a pattern, not just in New England, but all the colonies that we'll talk about as more people travel to the United States or the present day U.S. They'll start settlements. They'll move further inland. They'll push Native Americans off their lands, and eventually they'll remove all Native Americans into the Indian Territory, which is present day Oklahoma. Like I said, this is just the beginning of this cycle that we'll see with people pushing the Native Americans further and further west. So, okay, so there's your section 2 notes. Those will be up. Make sure you write these down, and then you'll have these for your test on chapter 3. Not sure when that'll be yet. Just make sure you get these and make sure you have them.